You may have heard that quote that the
Facts don't care about your feelings.
But hey, when it comes to persuading other people, it's the opposite. People's feelings do not care about your facts. In this video, I'm going to show you why your best arguments so often fall on deaf ears, and your best ideas get ignored by the people you want to get them through to. I'm going to show you the latest discoveries in neuroscience and what they show us about the two different parts of our brain that we use to think, and why you've been speaking to the wrong mind using the wrong tools, and why that so often backfires. My name's Michael McQueen. I'm a best-selling author who works with Fortune 500 brands around leadership, innovation, and adapting to change. When was the last time you caught yourself saying, I'm of two minds about this decision? Because you know there's something profoundly true about that statement, and it's not just about being indecisive. We as humans are actually in two different minds at any given moment, and most of us have no idea of that reality. My wife and I were looking to buy a new car recently. As we were going through all the different models, we got it down to two models to choose from. One was a model that was really sexy and fun. Everything instinctive in me wanted this car. The other was more logical, more sensible, more rational. It had great reviews online, but the sexy car had really poor reviews online. And as we were trying to decide, I remember saying to her, I feel like I'm of two minds about which car we should go with. And as I said that, I realized that there's actually something profoundly true about that statement. In so much of life, every single day, we're in two minds whether we realize it or not. Now, I want to sum up about a decade's worth of neuroscience in about 45 seconds, so strap in. Let's look at these two minds and how they work. Our first mind is something I refer to as the inquiring mind. And the inquiring mind lives at the front of our brain. It is the logical, linear, rational part of our thinking apparatus. Now, evolutionary biologists would tell you this is the most recent part of our brain to have developed. It's also part of our brain that takes a lot of energy to use. It is slow to use, and so therefore we just don't use it anywhere near as much as we think that we do. If you look at some research from Zoe Chance, who's a professor at Yale University, she would suggest we only use our inquiring mind for 5 to 10% of our decision making and our perception formation. The challenge is you and I spend the bulk of our time trying to persuade other people by appealing to the inquiring mind. What that means is 90 to 95% of what you communicate to others is falling on deaf ears because you're appealing to the wrong mind. I mean, you know what this feels like when you make the perfect case, use impeccable logic, and it just doesn't seem to get through. It falls on deaf ears because you're appealing to the wrong mind using the wrong tools. This is why people's feelings don't care about your facts. Even the best logic and the most watertight case doesn't work because you're appealing to the inquiring mind where that's not where people are thinking. So you might be thinking, what's the part of the brain we need to appeal to if we're going to persuade others or be influential? It's something I refer to as our instinctive mind. Now, if you look at where the instinctive mind lives, it is based at the top of the brainstem, a collection of brain regions called the limbic system. Now, the limbic system is where most of our fight and flight reflexes tend to reside. This is where we process emotion. It's also where our tribal impulses tend to reside. Now, our instinctive mind, this second mind of ours, is incredibly efficient. It works really fast. It's really good at recognizing patterns, in fact, creating narratives, maybe where there wasn't a narrative to begin with. But it's also a very old part of our brain. In fact, it was the original part of our brain that developed millennia ago. A colleague of mine puts it well. He suggests that using our instinctive mind is like using a piece of software that hasn't been updated in 40,000 years. Now, if you were to reboot a computer that hadn't been updated in like 3 or 4 years, you'd realize that it's not going to work very well in a modern era because it's not built for modern needs. Our instinctive mind is a little bit the same. Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert would suggest the biggest problem with climate change isn't that it's happening too fast, but that it's happening too slowly, or at least too slowly for our instinctive minds to identify or care about. Now, one of the most fascinating things about our instinctive mind is how it connects to our body. In fact, so much of what we think doesn't happen in our brains. It's also connected to things like our heart and our gut. And this matters because so many people are forming opinions based on what feels right as opposed to what they logically know to be right. In fact, both our heart and our gut have an intrinsic nervous system that connects to our brain, especially to the instinctive mind, and has a huge influence on not just how we feel, but also how we think and the judgments that we form. Our hearts actually have an intrinsic nervous system made up of 40,000 sensory neurites or neurons. Our gut has 500 million neurons. And if you look at some work by neurologist Robert Burton, he'd suggest that what this does is it creates a thing called the feeling of knowing. That sense that you know something is true, but you've got no logical reason for knowing it. And the biggest challenge is, what does this inform? Our instinctive mind. If they've got a deeply embedded, a deeply embodied sense of what's right or wrong, just giving them facts or logic will not touch the edges. See, here's the thing. Once your instinctive mind has been made up because of something in your heart or your gut, all the best logic in the world won't come close to changing that mind. You need to use a different approach, different techniques. If you speak to the wrong mind with the wrong tools, you will get nowhere. Now, I don't want to get bogged down into a whole lot of brain science. I want to give you a sense of how these two minds feel when we use them. And I'm going to show you in a few moments an advertisement from a Dutch pharmaceutical company. And there's something about this ad that doesn't quite add up. And I wonder if you can figure out what it is. Now, if you're like most people, perhaps your first instinct was to look for any typos perhaps in the advertisement. But if you've been pregnant, I want you to think about the third trimester of pregnancy. If you were to sum up the third trimester in one word, I imagine that one word might be a word like exasperated or uncomfortable or even exhausted. You know, a word that is unlikely to come up is the word surprised. Because truly, if you are that surprised at that point of a pregnancy that you are in fact pregnant, there are other questions to be asked. If you're like most people, you didn't notice this because what does our instinctive mind do? It identifies patterns, it creates narratives, it jumps to conclusions. And so I was like, pregnancy test, pregnant woman, nothing to see here. When I asked you to look again, your inquiring mind swung into action. You're like, how did I not see this? But more importantly, how did the advertisers not notice this before pressing print on this ad campaign? But we don't just process images with our instinctive minds, we also read with them. In fact, have a look at this notice board here. I wonder how many of you, as you read that, get tripped up with the top line and the typo in the top line. Perhaps you didn't even notice it. Read it again. And once you see it, it becomes so abundantly clear and you think, how did I not notice this? Why? Because we read with our instinctive minds. We look for patterns. That's one of the reasons we are so bad at proofreading our own work. You can read something 5 times that you've written and not notice the typo that is so obvious to someone who's looking at it for the first time. Now, this is not a criticism of our instinctive minds because, hey, they've kept us alive as a species for millennia. This habit of jumping to conclusions has kept us safe because when a threat emerges, our instinctive minds swing into action and our fight, flight or freeze reflexes also get fired off. That's what keeps us alive. The problem is this. Our instinctive minds respond to psychological threats the same way they do to physical ones. So when we're exposed to information, ideas, logic, the best arguments that seem threatening, that seem confronting or are unfamiliar, our instinctive minds react as if they are a threat. But we don't go into fight, flight, and freeze. Our instinctive minds have 3 other very different defensive responses we must be aware of. Now, our first instinctive response is to deny. You know, we've been told for years that seeing is believing, but the reality is our instinctive minds have an amazing capacity to only see what they've already decided to be true. If you've got a set of bathroom scales in your bathroom at home, I'd make a bet the way you engage with those bathroom scales shows exactly this principle in action. If you hop onto those scales and the number that pops up is bad news, it's not the number you were hoping for, what do you do if you're like most people? You begin to bargain with reality. You think, oh, maybe the scales are broken, or maybe it was that glass of water I had when I got out of bed, maybe that just tipped me over the scale, or maybe I was putting too much weight on one foot or the other, or maybe the scales aren't sitting flat on the floor. And yet what happens when the scales deliver a number that's a good news number? You don't ask any other questions. You get straight off as quick as you can and straight into the shower. And yet we do the same thing when we're weighing up ideas. If the information we're receiving or being exposed to confirms what we've already decided is true or what we want to believe is true, we don't ask any other questions. See, our instinctive minds would much rather feel right than be right. The second protective instinct is to defend, to get defensive. You know, we all know someone who's a close talker. You know those people when in conversation, they just keep moving closer and closer to you. And what is your instinctive response? To move further and further back. We do the same thing when it comes to considering ideas. When information feels like it's threatening, our response is to get defensive, to move back into a defensive position. Now consider this billboard here as a perfect example of that defensive reaction. The billboard was erected as part of a public health campaign to alert men to the fact that they don't go to the doctor anywhere near frequently enough. And yet, within 24 hours, a local with a spray can in the back of his car had made a little addition to the billboard, and it's a perfect case in point. Now, when we are told what to think or what to feel, it's amazing how quickly that defensive reaction is kicked off for all of us. And it's not just men more than women, it is such a natural human thing to do. I love the insight of Oliver Wendell Holmes. He said, it's a rare person who wants to hear what they don't want to hear. The third protective instinct is to defer. One of the things our instinctive minds love to do is get tribal, to look at what people like us are thinking or doing in response or reaction and then follow suit accordingly. Now, one of the key questions our instinctive minds are asking when being asked to consider an idea or a piece of information is, what do people like me think about ideas like this? Now, a perfect example of this whole deferral dynamic. A guy named Ben Bowling was giving the valedictorian address at his high school graduation ceremony in Republican heartland, Tennessee. He said, I know at these sort of things you're meant to share inspirational quotes, so I went onto Google and found a few. The first one to share is this.
Don't just get involved, fight for your seat at the table. Better yet, fight for a seat at the head of the table. Donald J. Trump.
And the crowd went wild. There was cheering and applause. And then he said, oh no, sorry, I was just joking. That was a quote from Obama.
I'm kidding. That was Barack Obama.
And there was silence. In fact, a few people booed. This very thing they had just agreed with so vehemently a few moments earlier, now they couldn't disagree with more. Why? Because someone from the other side said it. Now, our instinctive minds have an amazing ability to dismiss a message simply because of the messenger. You and I would like to think that we are really rational and logical and reasonable, that we tend to use our inquiring mind most when we're thinking and making decisions. The simple reality is we're not. Most of us, most of the time, are thinking with our instinctive minds. Now, you can ignore that or try and fight against that, but you know what? If you want to be truly persuasive, to be influential, to have the best ideas come to the table and have impact, you need to speak to the instinctive mind, because that's where stubbornness lives. So I hope that was helpful. If you've ever had that experience where you're trying to get your message through and you're like, what is happening inside that person's brain? Now you know. Now, it's one thing to know why people can be closed-minded, but if you want to increase the odds of open-mindedness, check out this video here. It'll give you some really practical tips on how to do just that.